In the winter of 1595, the Ottoman royal nursery fell silent, not because the children were asleep, but because 19 of them had just drawn their final breath. The late 16th century Ottoman Empire was a world of contradictions, its wealth and power unmatched across 3 continents, yet its survival hinged on an unspoken truth. To keep the throne warm, the family must be kept cold. Istanbul was the beating heart of an empire of millions, yet its most important political ritual took place behind locked doors, without fanfare, without mercy. When Mehmed III ascended the throne that year, he did not merely inherit a crown, he inherited a tradition, one set down in law by his ancestor Mehmed II, known blandly as the Law of Fratricide. Officially, it was a safeguard against civil war. In practice, it was a family reunion from which only one man returned alive. The law was ruthlessly simple. At the moment of accession, every other male of the dynasty, regardless of age, was to be executed before he could become a rival. No trials, no appeals. The act was carried out not in public, but in the hushed chambers of the palace, by the Sultan's most trusted servants, the deaf-mute executioners. Mehmed's interpretation of this tradition would be remembered as one of the most infamous in Ottoman history. On the night of his coronation, he ordered the deaths of 19 brothers, some barely old enough to walk, in a coordinated operation that was equal parts political necessity and macabre ceremony. Around him stood the figures who made it possible: his grandmother, Safiye Sultan, the calculating force behind the throne; the executioners, silent and efficient; and even his own son, Shehzade Mahmud, whose fate would one day mirror that of his uncles. One European diplomat, writing in disbelief, put it plainly: the Ottoman succession begins with the death of all its heirs. This is the story of how a dynasty preserved itself by erasing itself. Like and subscribe to explore history's darkest chapters with us. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you've ever had a family reunion end worse than this one. When Mehmed III's father, Sultan Murad III, died in January 1595, the Ottoman Empire already knew what would happen next. Not the coronation, not the celebrations, the killing. The law of fratricide was no dusty clause buried in forgotten archives. It was a living, breathing part of succession, enacted with the same inevitability as the sunrise. It had been introduced more than a century earlier by Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. He was not a man who liked leaving things to chance, and in his eyes, nothing was riskier than a pack of ambitious brothers with armies at their disposal. Ottoman succession was not like Europe's tidy rules of primogeniture. It was a winner-takes-all contest in which every prince technically had a claim. Before the law, it often ended in civil war. Mehmed II's answer was brutally efficient. Once a prince took the throne, every other surviving brother was to be executed. The reasoning was framed as benevolent. Better the blood of a few than the blood of thousands in a succession war. It was an argument that sounded strangely rational in the council chamber, but looked far less noble in the nursery. Over the decades, the law became more than a legal clause. It became a ritual. Ministers justified it as preventive governance, a phrase as dry as it was lethal. Chroniclers recorded it without outrage, noting names and numbers as though they were ledger entries. And inside the palace, the act was performed with an almost ceremonial detachment. When Murad III died, the machinery of this law clicked instantly into place. Servants whispered through the corridors. Eunuchs tightened their control of the harem. The royal guards doubled their watch, not against outside threats, but to keep the young princes from slipping away. Mehmed III, at that moment still a prince, became sultan the instant his father's final breath left him. But his promotion came with an immediate unspoken job description: eliminate every other possible claimant before breakfast. The empire would wait for no man, and certainly for no child, to finish mourning. The official justification was straightforward. If even one brother lived, he could become a rallying point for rebellion. If a rebellion succeeded, civil war would tear apart the empire's fragile balance between provinces, janissaries, and court factions. The fratricide law, they insisted, was a surgical strike to remove that threat. This explanation, of course, required ignoring the fact that these threats were often swaddled infants. The logic was that a baby might one day become a man, and a man might one day raise an army, and therefore it was best to intervene early, before the baby developed dangerous habits like breathing. The order was not given in the heat of passion. It was calm, procedural, and cold. Mehmed III did not draft it himself. It was understood. Palace officials had rehearsed this moment for years, knowing the transition would come. In a sense, the law had become flesh long before Mehmed signed off on the first strangling. It lived in the expectations of everyone around him. Foreign diplomats, reading the empire's laws, found the clause shocking. Venetian envoys in particular reported home with horror, describing the practice as both barbaric and absurd in its bureaucratic neatness. Yet within the palace, the killings were not scandal, they were policy. One might expect that such a law would weigh heavily on a young sultan, but Mehmed's upbringing had been steeped in the awareness that survival meant the absence of rivals. He had spent much of his life in confinement under the cafes system, where princes were kept in guarded apartments, taught statecraft, and given the unspoken lesson that their brothers were not companions, but future corpses. So when the moment came, Mehmed III did not hesitate. The law demanded his hand, but not his emotion. To him this was not a choice, it was the first duty of a ruler. The Ottoman Empire would wake to a new sultan, but 19 royal heartbeats would not wake at all. The law of fratricide had been triggered. Now it needed a delivery method, one that would gather every potential victim in one place without raising suspicion. In the palace, deception was as much a tool of governance as armies or taxes. Mehmed III would employ it with unsettling creativity. The chosen ruse was the promise of a celebration, a circumcision ceremony. In the Ottoman court, such events were grand affairs, marking a prince's transition toward manhood. They were attended by family, servants, musicians, and entertainers, with lavish feasts laid out beneath banners and embroidered canopies. The atmosphere was supposed to be one of joy, blessings, and music. For the younger princes, the summons must have seemed like an invitation to a rare moment of festivity in their cloistered lives. These were children raised in guarded apartments, their only companions often eunuchs and tutors. A day filled with colours, sweetmeats, and games would have been a novelty. The letter of invitation made no mention of death. Preparations moved quickly. Palace servants hung bright fabrics and arranged trays of sugared almonds. The air was heavy with incense, not merely to please the senses, but to mask what would follow. The corridors of Topkapi Palace filled with movement, the kind that could be mistaken for festivity if you didn't notice the shadows in the corners. The irony was sharp. A ceremony meant to symbolize life's continuation was being used to engineer its abrupt end. To an outsider, it might have looked like a contradiction. To the Ottoman court, it was simply practical. A joyous occasion ensured that all the brothers would gather without resistance. Into this stage stepped the palace's most unusual figures, the deaf-mute executioners. They were dressed in their distinctive uniforms, designed to be recognized instantly by anyone who saw them, a constant reminder of the Sultan's reach. In ordinary times, these men performed mundane duties, from guarding doors to serving in the harem. In extraordinary times, they carried out sentences too sensitive for ordinary soldiers. Their silence was not symbolic, it was functional. They could not overhear state secrets. They could not repeat orders. And when the stranglings began, there would be no screams, only the muffled movements of silk cords tightening. In the language of palace politics, the absence of sound was its own form of loyalty. In the hours before the gathering, the young princes were bathed, perfumed, and dressed in their finest garments. It was an old Ottoman custom to present them at their best during significant occasions. That this occasion was their last, did not alter the tradition. The Sultan's staff orchestrated the timing carefully. The brothers were brought to the appointed chambers under the pretense of waiting for the festivities to begin. Meanwhile, the executioners prepared in adjoining rooms, their cords coiled neatly in their hands. The mechanics of the killings had been discussed in advance, parallel actions to ensure no opportunity for panic or escape. From the outside, the rooms still looked festive. Candles flickered, carpets muffled the footsteps, and the scent of incense thickened. The mood was one of suspended anticipation, as though the entire palace was holding its breath. Those who knew what was coming were careful not to betray it with their expressions. In many ways, the ceremony was theatre, and the palace was its stage. Every gesture, the greetings, the offerings of sherbet, the formal seating arrangements, was part of a script that ended not with applause, but with the quiet collapse of bodies onto silk cushions. The deaf-mutes would emerge only at the cue, moving with a speed and precision that came from long practice. By the time the reality set in for the victims, the outcome was already decided. The celebration had been the bait, and the law of fratricide was the hook. Mehmed III did not need to watch the killings to ensure they happened. The ritual had been perfected over generations. All he had to do was give the signal, and the music of the circumcision feast would be replaced by a silence deeper than any prayer. When the signal was given, it did not come with shouts or a flourish of music. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly. One servant stepping into the room, another leaving, a nod from a chamberlain. The kind of subtle shift in movement that meant nothing to a child and everything to those who understood palace politics. The deaf-mute executioners entered like a shadow passing over a candle. They carried no swords, no knives. In their hands were loops of silk cord, smooth, strong, and silent. In Ottoman thinking, strangulation with silk was a mark of royal respect. It spilled no blood and left no messy evidence. Dignity, they called it, though its dignity was cold comfort to those on the receiving end. Each brother had his own executioner. This was a point of efficiency, but also of control. No single executioner could fail to act without the others noticing. The work began almost simultaneously, in parallel rooms, so that no survivor could hear the fate of another and have time to resist. In one chamber, a young prince sat cross-legged, still waiting for the celebration to start. In another, an infant was cradled by a caretaker who had known his fate for hours but had been ordered to keep him calm. The executioners moved in with the same measured precision they used to pour sherbet for guests. Grip, tighten, wait. The palace chroniclers did not dwell on the details. They wrote of 19 princes dispatched, as though the sentence described parcels sent by courier. But the reality was a series of short, sudden endings, repeated again and again, each in its own enclosed world, unseen by the others. Even the unborn were not spared. Concubines visibly pregnant were among those executed, their deaths justified by the same logic that had condemned the boys. Better to eliminate a future threat than risk it maturing into one. The law had no interest in beginnings. It was obsessed with preventing endings that did not favor the Sultan. Outside the execution rooms, the palace remained eerily still. No court music played, no messengers hurried through the corridors. The silence was its own kind of noise, dense, heavy, inescapable. The smell of incense grew thicker, masking what needed to be masked. Somewhere in the complex, Mehmed III waited, whether he sat in prayer, in thought, or in the simple stillness of someone letting the machinery run without interference. No one recorded. His presence was not necessary. The system he had inherited was perfectly capable of killing without his supervision. The bodies, once the work was done, were handled with the same detached efficiency. They were laid out, covered in fine cloth, and prepared for burial beside their father, Murad III. No grand procession, no public mourning, only a transfer from one guarded space to another, as if the princes were still in confinement, only quieter. By dawn, the entire operation was complete. Servants cleared away the decorations from the sham celebration. The executioners vanished back into the palace's unseen corridors. The day's business could now proceed with the comforting knowledge that the Ottoman throne had been rendered entirely safe from family competition. For the court, it was simply the cost of stability. For the empire, it was the smooth continuation of a centuries-old tradition. And for 19 brothers, it was the end of every possibility but one: to serve, in death, as proof that the Sultan's will was absolute. The chroniclers moved on to the next matter of state. The foreign envoys prepared their reports, and Istanbul awoke unaware that the dynasty had just erased nearly an entire generation of itself. All that remained was the faint scent of incense, clinging to the air long after the bodies had been carried away. Under the high, domed ceilings of Topkapi Palace, the woman who had outlived 3 sultans and maneuvered through 4 decades of court intrigue moved as if the corridors themselves obeyed her. Safiye Sultan, Venetian by birth and Ottoman by mastery, carried herself with the stillness of someone for whom the palace was less a residence than a chessboard. Servants averted their eyes, not out of respect alone, but from the suspicion that she noticed more in a glance than most learned in a day. Her influence over Mehmed III did not spring from sudden opportunity. Long before he took the throne, she had been his grandmother, guardian, and political instructor, shaping his understanding of survival in a world where survival was a conditional privilege. Contemporary chroniclers noted her skill in balancing the Janissary's demands with the competing ambitions of court factions, a balance often maintained with gifts, promises, and the occasional disappearance. In the Ottoman harem, such balancing was not diplomacy, it was daily maintenance. By 1595, the year Murad III died, Safiye's position was unassailable. She had secured Mehmed's succession not simply by removing rivals, but by ensuring that every voice of consequence within the palace spoke in unison when the moment came. It was said she could turn a whisper into policy faster than the divan could record a decree. Her power did not rest on titles, though she held the title Valide Sultan, but on her ability to make others believe that resisting her was less practical than cooperating. When news reached her that Murad's body had grown cold, she was already moving. Witnesses later wrote of her calm, deliberate presence, a phrase that might equally have described an executioner tying a perfect knot. She knew the law of fratricide would demand action before dawn, and she ensured the machinery was oiled. The palace gates were secured, the executioners summoned, and the festive charade for Mehmed's brothers allowed to proceed without a hint of its darker purpose. Her public demeanour that day gave no suggestion of what was about to happen. Dressed in embroidered silks, she greeted foreign envoys with the measured warmth of someone attending a banquet rather than a mass killing. One European diplomat recorded her serving sherbet to guests in the late afternoon. The sweet drink offered in porcelain cups while, somewhere behind a guarded door, deaf mutes prepared lengths of silk cord. The anecdote endures in Ottoman histories, not for its cruelty, but for its unshakable composure. Safiye understood the optics. To foreign ambassadors, the palace had to appear serene, even festive. To the Janissaries, it had to appear decisive, free from hesitation that might invite rebellion. And to Mehmed, who had never ordered a death of such magnitude, it had to appear inevitable. In this, she was the stage director, ensuring that each player entered on cue and that the performance ended without interruption. Her own Venetian origins were often overlooked by those who saw only the Ottoman veil. Born Sophia Baffo, she had been brought to the harem decades earlier, a diplomatic gift wrapped in youth and beauty. Yet she had survived the transition from favoured consort to political matriarch, a shift that left many women discarded or dead. Her method was not open confrontation but the steady accumulation of leverage, favour owed here, a debt recorded there, each one a future safeguard. The massacre of Mehmed's brothers was, to her, less an act of brutality than a point on the imperial calendar. Other women of the harem may have wept in private. Safiye kept her expression smooth, as though 19 lives were merely items crossed from a ledger. Such detachment was not coldness in her eyes, but prudence, an emotional economy learned in a system where excess feeling was a liability. Later that night, as the palace settled under the muffled weight of its silence, she remained visible. A figure moving through lamplit galleries, she offered short, controlled words to those who passed, reinforcing the impression that all had gone as it should. Even the next morning, when incense cloaked the air and the marble floors were scrubbed, her walk through the court was steady. The performance, as far as she was concerned, was complete. It was this consistency, this refusal to appear altered by what had occurred, that reinforced her reputation. To the court, Safiye was a constant, a fixed point in the shifting constellations of Ottoman politics. To foreign observers, she was the invisible hand that could shape an empire's future with the same precision she shaped its present. Mehmed might have worn the crown, but it was she who ensured it sat securely on his head. There were whispers, of course, claims that she had overstepped, that the Sultan was little more than a puppet. The accusations mattered little. In the palace, perception was not measured by truth, but by repetition. And in the months following the massacre, the repetition was that Mehmed ruled because Safiye wished him to. Even those who resented her influence acknowledged that without her, the throne might have been contested before Mehmed's first decree was signed. Her mastery lay not only in manipulation, but in her timing. The night of the stranglings was not the culmination of her power, but its renewal. Every prince removed was a potential rival erased. Every breath Mehmed took as Sultan was, indirectly, an affirmation of her strategy. For now, the empire was secure, the succession decided, and the law of fratricide had been executed, efficiently, silently, and under her watch. And yet, the corridors of Topkapi were never still for long. The same system that had eliminated 19 princes could, in time, turn inward again. Safiye knew this as well as anyone. In the Ottoman court, victories were measured in seasons, not lifetimes. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, events were already gathering that would test both Mehmed's reign and her own place at its center. The deaf mutes of the Ottoman palace moved like shadows, in corridors where every sound mattered. Their silence was not simply the absence of speech, it was a presence in itself, a weight that followed them through gilded gates and candlelit halls. Recruited young, often from Christian families in the Balkans or the Caucasus, they were trained to serve in the innermost spaces of imperial life, rooms where words could be dangerous and the lack of them could be an asset beyond price. Their dual role blurred the line between servant and instrument of state. In 1 hour, a mute might pour the Sultan's sherbet, fanning away the heat of the summer air. In the next, he might tighten a bowstring around the neck of a prince. In both cases, the requirement was the same: absolute obedience, no record of speech, and no risk of information leaking into the labyrinthine gossip channels of the harem or the divan. Silence was their shield, but also their binding. It was this silence that made them ideal for the law of fratricide. When a sultan ordered the elimination of his rivals, the task could not fall to ordinary guards. Too many tongues, too many ears. A deaf mute left no verbal trail. He could neither overhear nor repeat secrets, and even his footsteps were trained into quiet precision. In a court where rumour could undo months of planning, such men were as close as the empire came to a secure channel. The palace maintained a specialized corps for these men, housed near the imperial apartments. They dressed simply compared to the jeweled finery of other servants, their uniforms marked more by function than display. Yet the sight of them, particularly in groups, was enough to drain colour from the face of anyone who understood their purpose. Chroniclers noted that the arrival of a pair of mutes at a noble's chamber door rarely signified good fortune. In daily service, they were skilled in gestures, a codified sign language unique to the Ottoman court. It allowed them to convey complex instructions without a syllable, the movement of hands replacing the murmur of messengers. This same silent communication, so valued in the kitchens and treasuries, became even more chilling when deployed in the antechambers of execution. Mehmed III inherited their loyalty as automatically as he inherited the throne. On the night of the 19 stranglings, the mutes acted with the same steady detachment they might employ when arranging cushions or pouring wine. Each was assigned to a target, each knew his station, Each waited for the subtle hand signal that began the operation. Parallel killings required perfect timing, and here again, their silence was an advantage. No cry, no shouted order, just the unseen ripple of movement from room to room. Their training emphasized more than technique. It cultivated the absence of hesitation. In a court defined by hesitation's dangers, this was a survival skill. A mute executioner could not refuse, he could only perform. And yet, palace law held that some, after years of service, developed an uncanny ability to anticipate orders before they were given, stepping forward at moments when others were still gauging the Sultan's mood. Ironically, their lack of speech made them figures of intense speculation. Courtiers would study their expressions, rarely more than neutral masks, for signs of approaching doom. A chance encounter in a hallway could ruin a man's sleep for weeks. In this way, their very existence became a psychological weapon, extending the Sultan's reach without a word spoken. Foreign envoys recorded them in their reports, often with fascination tinged by unease. One Venetian described them as living instruments, tools to be wielded without risk of betrayal. Another noted the paradox that they were both trusted with the Sultan's life and dispatched to end the lives of his closest kin. In a bureaucracy capable of producing such contradictions, the mutes were both symptom and solution. Their careers could span decades, and while some retired into quiet obscurity, others remained at court until age slowed their movements. No memoirs remain, their silence continued beyond their service, but their presence is scattered across imperial records, appearing in terse notations, execution carried out by the deaf mutes, without disturbance. After Mehmed's night of 19, their role was not diminished. In fact, their reputation grew sharper. Each new sultan knew they were not merely servants. They were the physical manifestation of the imperial will, the hands that carried out what the pen dared not write. A law might be decreed in the divan, but it was made real in the grip of these silent men. And like the law itself, they endured beyond individual reigns, outliving sultans and seeing the same cycles repeat. For them, the palace was less a stage than a workshop, where human lives were raw material, and silence was the only sound of duty fulfilled. Somewhere in those corridors, silk cords remained coiled and ready, waiting for the next signal no one would ever hear. The Imperial Council, the Divan, assembled beneath a ceiling painted with gold leaf and geometric stars, its beauty doing little to disguise the business at hand. Cushioned seats were arranged in precise symmetry, low enough to remind each advisor that, in the Ottoman hierarchy, no man sat higher than the Sultan. Here, policy was debated, petitions heard, and, on occasion, mass killings rationalized into administrative necessity. The Divan was not composed of philosophers pondering moral dilemmas, but of senior statesmen who had learned that the safest opinion was the one that matched the Sultan's own. Grand viziers, military commanders, and judicial scholars occupied these seats, each bringing a wealth of experience in governing an empire that spanned 3 continents. Yet when the question of succession arose, their collective expertise narrowed to a single principle: stability at any cost. The law of fratricide provided the perfect frame for this principle. Introduced under Mehmed II, it was understood by the council less as a choice than as a procedural formality. A new sultan's first order, eliminate all potential claimants, was recorded with the same brisk efficiency as a tax adjustment or the appointment of a provincial governor. In this sense, the Divan was not so much a moral compass as a translation device, converting lethal intent into legal language. On the morning of Mehmed III's accession in 1595, the council did not meet to debate whether the 19 stranglings should occur. That decision had been made centuries earlier, woven into the empire's very operating manual. Instead, their task was to ensure that the operation met the requirements of precedent: swift, coordinated, and final. To delay would invite uncertainty. Uncertainty invited factions. Factions invited civil war. And civil war was far more dangerous to an empire than the deaths of a few princes. Some chroniclers claimed that minor debates did occur over the order in which the princes should be dispatched, or whether to begin before all were assembled. These were not questions of ethics, but of efficiency. In one account, a council member reportedly suggested that simultaneous executions would minimize distress among the victims, as if mercy could be measured in minutes. Foreign diplomats who heard of these deliberations often expressed horror, but the divan itself remained unmoved. Ottoman governance prized continuity above sentiment, and continuity was secured by ensuring that the Sultan's position could not be contested. Within the marble halls of the palace, fratricide was not cruelty, it was policy implementation. In private, some advisors may have felt unease, yet none dared voice it in the council chamber. The risk was not merely political, it was existential. To oppose the Sultan's will on such a matter was to mark oneself as an obstacle, and obstacles in the Ottoman system were removed with the same precision as rival princes. The council's role was to support, not to question. The divan's minutes from such days, when they survived, were conspicuously sparse. Official records might note only that the succession had been secured, and the empire's unity assured. The 19 deaths themselves were often absent from the language, replaced by abstract terms that could fit neatly into the annals of state. Bureaucratic phrasing turned the bloodless strangling of children into an achievement of order. Yet the absurdity was evident to any who looked closely. A council that could spend hours debating grain tariffs, or the proper dimensions of a bridge span, could dispatch with the extermination of a generation in less time than it took to pour tea. It was a theatre of governance, where procedure lent legitimacy to acts that would otherwise defy reason. The foreign embassies in Istanbul watched these rituals with a mix of fascination and alarm. Venetian and Habsburg envoys sent letters home, attempting to explain how an empire so cultured, so administratively sophisticated, could treat hereditary slaughter as a clerical matter. Their confusion was often tinged with grudging respect. After all, the Ottoman state did not collapse under the weight of succession disputes, precisely because it erased them before they began. When the council adjourned after Mehmed's accession, its members dispersed through the palace as though any other day's business had concluded. They would reconvene soon enough to discuss the war against Austria, trade negotiations, and the latest petitions from distant provinces. In the meantime, 19 new graves would be dug, and the empire would present itself to the world as unshaken, its governance unbroken. The divan's genius, if it can be called that, lay in its ability to transform survival into a system. It was a machine that produced stability out of absence, erasing potential futures so that one path alone remained. In such a system, the council was less an advisory body than a chorus, reciting the lines that kept the play running, no matter how often the cast was changed. And as long as the throne remained warm, the divan considered its work done. Under the shadow of the early Ottoman court, succession was not a matter of calm ceremony but of speed, steel, and shifting loyalties. Princes were raised to see the throne not as an inheritance but as a contested prize, one claimed not by seniority but by the swiftness with which one could rally soldiers to the city gates. The death of a sultan often marked the beginning, not the end, of a war. Courtiers held their breath in those interludes, listening for hoofbeats in the streets of Bursa or Edirne, knowing that the first to arrive in the capital would claim the empire and the lives of his brothers. Even then, claim was a generous term. The process resembled a siege conducted within the royal family itself. Before Mehmed II's reforms, the empire had already witnessed these fraternal wars in miniature. When Sultan Bayezid II died at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, his sons fractured the realm into rival camps, each gathering janissaries, sipahis, and opportunistic beys. For 11 years, the interregnum bled the empire in a conflict that mixed personal vendetta with provincial opportunism. Cities changed hands with dizzying frequency. Taxes were collected twice over, and promises of office were made with the casual generosity of men who had no intention of keeping them. By the time Mehmed I as sole ruler in 1413, the Ottoman state had survived, but at a cost that made the memory of brotherly competition a cautionary tale rather than a romantic saga. The problem lay in the system's very design. Unlike many European monarchies of the period, which leaned on primogeniture, The Ottomans recognized all sons of a sultan as equally legitimate contenders. This principle, intended to avoid disputes over illegitimacy, instead guaranteed them. Every prince was sent to govern a province as part of his political education, giving him both the training to rule and a base from which to launch a military bid for the throne. It was a system that cultivated capable leaders and ensured they would eventually try to kill each other. Such contests could be spectacular in their chaos. In 1481, the death of Mehmed II triggered a swift clash between his sons Bayezid and Sem. Bayezid arrived in Constantinople first, securing the Janissaries with timely gifts, while Shem retreated to Bursa, raising an army from the Anatolian heartland. Their battle at Yeni Shahir was decisive. Shem's defeat sent him into exile, first to the Mamluks and later into the curious position of being a diplomatic pawn in the courts of Rhodes, Rome, and France. His brother's reign began not with a coronation but with an accounting of which provincial governors had chosen wrongly and would pay for it. The court chroniclers, in their careful prose, rarely lingered on the practical aftermath of these failed bids. Prison, exile, or execution could follow, but there was no fixed pattern. Some princes were quietly strangled, others spent their remaining years in a haze of ceremonial isolation. This unpredictability meant that every succession crisis drew the entire imperial hierarchy into weeks of tense calculations, their livelihoods tied to which prince they had favoured. A misplaced allegiance could erase decades of service in a single afternoon. The Janissaries, as the empire's elite military corps, were both kingmakers and opportunists in these contests. Their support could be bought, but never permanently secured. Each succession dispute offered them the chance to demand bonuses, privileges, or the removal of disliked officials. For the Sultan who emerged victorious, their loyalty came at the price of a treasury already strained by civil war. The pattern became almost formulaic. A sultan's death, a scramble for military backing, a brief but bloody confrontation, and the awarding of costly rewards to those who had delivered the throne. Foreign observers watched these episodes with fascination and occasional disbelief. Venetian envoys, noting the speed with which princes mobilized armies, commented on the Ottomans' singular preparedness for war against their own blood. Reports from Ragusa and Genoa carried the same tone of wonder tinged with alarm. The empire's enemies saw opportunity in these moments of disunity. Border skirmishes often flared when a succession dispute consumed the court's attention. Yet the Ottomans, resilient in their administrative structure, managed to reconsolidate each time, an efficiency that made the whole cycle appear, in retrospect, almost deliberate. For the ruling family, this natural contest was anything but. Every prince grew up with the knowledge that his brothers were both companions and eventual rivals. Childhood games in the palace gardens were played under the silent understanding that only one might live to be sultan. Lessons in governance were paired with lessons in vigilance, the art of winning loyalty, the timing of a march, the choice of when to ride for the capital. The empire trained its heirs not to succeed each other, but to survive each other. Over time, the Ottoman state recognized the instability this produced, especially as the empire expanded and provincial bases of power became harder to control. By the mid-15th century, Mehmed II sought a legal framework to replace the unpredictable bloodletting with something more, in the administrative sense, efficient. His law of fratricide, enshrined in the Kanun name, was presented as a preventive measure, a grim but orderly alternative to civil war. Under this code, the killing of brothers was no longer the chaotic result of conflict, but the structured opening act of a reign. If succession had once been a gamble, it was now a procedure. That shift did not soften the reality, but it did change its rhythm. Princes no longer raised armies. They awaited their turn in the capital, well aware of the law that hung over them. The public spectacle of rival marches was replaced by the quieter theatre of palace intrigue. The winners no longer needed to fight pitched battles. They needed only to survive long enough to inherit the machinery of the law. In this way, the Ottoman court replaced one form of brutality with another, less visible, but no less final. The law's defenders argued that it spared the empire from years of ruinous infighting. Its critics, at least those who spoke privately, noted that it also extinguished generations of capable leaders before they could rule. But for the men who enforced it, the change was a triumph of governance over chance. In the ledgers of the imperial bureaucracy, stability was measured not in the number of survivors, but in the absence of civil war. The silk cord, after all, was cheaper than a campaign. And so, by the time Mehmed III came to power, the precedent was centuries deep. He was not innovating when he ordered the deaths of his 19 brothers. He was simply fulfilling the logic set in motion long before his birth. The age of fraternal war had passed, replaced by something colder, quieter, and infinitely more predictable. Where once the sound of succession was the clash of armies outside the city walls, it was now the muted tread of palace guards along marble corridors. The outcome was no longer in doubt, only the timing. The cafes, or cage, was less a cell than a gilded oubliette. Within the secure walls of the imperial palace, it served as both sanctuary and sentence, a place where potential heirs were kept under the watchful eye of the harem and away from the provinces that had once been their proving grounds. Mehmed III entered this world as a child, already marked by the peculiar logic of Ottoman succession. Survival meant invisibility. The cage was meant to preserve princes until needed, yet in preserving them, it also stifled the very skills they might require to rule. The rooms of the cafes were richly appointed, with latticework screens filtering sunlight into fractured patterns on the tiled floors. From these screens, a prince could see the sky, but not the world. He could hear the bustle of the outer courts without ever joining it. Guards stood outside day and night, their presence constant but wordless. Conversations with outsiders were limited and monitored, conducted in the hushed tones of those who knew that curiosity could be mistaken for ambition. For Mehmed, childhood became a slow accumulation of silences, punctuated only by lessons and the occasional ceremonial appearance before his father. The official purpose of the cafes was to prevent the kind of armed contests that had plagued earlier generations. By keeping princes in the palace, the Sultan reduced the chance of them cultivating provincial loyalties that could be turned into military threats. Yet the unintended effect was to raise a generation of rulers whose experience of the empire was framed by the narrow geometry of their chambers. Mehmed learned his geography from maps and court reports, rather than from the road. His understanding of war came from miniature paintings and the measured recitation of histories, not from the dust of a campaign trail. Education within the cage was thorough, if selective. Tutors instructed Mehmed in Quranic studies, Ottoman history, calligraphy, and the intricacies of palace etiquette. Political lessons were embedded in parables, often stripped of their messier conclusions. Court musicians and poets were occasionally summoned to perform, offering glimpses of a broader culture without revealing the streets, markets, and fields from which it came. Even this curated exposure reinforced the central truth of his life. All roads led inward toward the throne room, but few ever led out. The harem played a decisive role in shaping a prince's character under such conditions. Mehmed's mother and grandmother, Safiye Sultan, acted as both protectors and political tutors. Safiye, in particular, understood the cage as a testing ground for patience, a crucible where restraint could become a weapon. She encouraged her grandson to master the art of waiting, to cultivate a stillness that would one day be mistaken for authority. In her eyes, survival in the cage was proof of a prince's fitness to survive the palace itself. Yet, patience had its costs. Princes confined for years developed a habit of caution that could harden into distrust. Mehmed watched as attendants came and went, some dismissed quietly, others promoted without obvious reason. Friendships within the cage were tentative, often ending abruptly when one prince was summoned away, whether to the throne or to a quieter fate. The walls did not merely confine, they edited reality, ensuring that a prince saw only what was safe for him to see. In such an environment, the imagination became both a refuge and a risk. Beyond the physical restrictions, the cage carried a constant psychological weight. Every prince knew why it existed. The law of fratricide hung over their lives like an unspoken sentence. Its presence acknowledged in the careful avoidance of certain topics. A misplaced word could be carried beyond the latticed walls by an attendant eager to display loyalty to the reigning sultan. Mehmed learned to speak in careful phrases, layered with plausible deniability. Even in private, conversation was an exercise in strategic ambiguity. Despite the isolation, the cage was not entirely static. News from the outside world seeped in through official briefings, the murmurs of eunuchs, and the subtle changes in palace routine. Mehmed would have known of military campaigns, diplomatic visits, and the shifting balance of court factions. These fragments were assembled into a mental map of the empire, one drawn from second-hand accounts, yet vivid enough to feed both ambition and anxiety. The outside world existed for him as a series of reports, each carrying its own invisible agendas. The rhythm of life in the cage was steady to the point of ritual. Morning prayers, lessons, meals at fixed hours, and evenings spent in reading or quiet games created a sense of suspended time. Years could pass with little to distinguish one from another. For some princes, this monotony dulled the edge of political instinct. For others, like Mehmed, it honed an inner vigilance, an ability to measure significance in small shifts, a new guard at the door, a change in the tone of a tutor's lesson. It was from this measured, almost cloistered existence that Mehmed stepped into the full theatre of power upon his father's death. The transformation from confined observer to absolute ruler was abrupt, even by Ottoman standards. One day he was a prince behind screens. The next, the law demanded he act as executor of his own bloodline. The discipline learned in the cage, the silence, the waiting, the precision of action, now found its application in a single, irreversible night. Historians have debated whether the cage produced better or worse rulers. Its defenders argued that it prevented rebellion and prepared heirs for the burdens of isolation inherent to monarchy. Its critics saw it as breeding insecurity, detachment, and paranoia. Mehmed's reign would offer evidence for both views. The composure he displayed during the executions of 1595 was the same composure the cage had taught him, yet the suspicion that later consumed his rule may also have been born there. In this sense, the cage was not just a place, but a formative condition. By the time Mehmed emerged from behind the lattices for the last time, he carried with him the habits of a life lived in perpetual readiness for either ascension or death. The cage had not broken him, but it had shaped him into a ruler for whom the line between family and enemy was thin, perhaps non-existent. When he ascended, the walls that had confined him became the corridors of his own palace, and the lessons of the cage, restraint, calculation, and silent endurance, became the guiding principles of his reign. The empire outside might have been vast, but for Mehmed, it would always be approached as one might approach a door with a guard on the other side. Istanbul in the 1592 was a city of contradictions, a capital at the height of imperial splendor and yet perched on the edge of unease. The skyline still dazzled with its forest of domes and minarets, the works of Sinan and his successors casting long shadows over the Bosphorus. Trade poured in from 3 continents, filling the bazaars with spices from India, furs from Muscovy, and silks from Persia. The air in the markets was heavy with the scent of roasting coffee and tanned leather, while muezzins called the faithful to prayer from towers that had themselves become symbols of the empire's permanence. Yet beneath this surface, the city was quietly bracing for storms both within and without. 2 great wars framed the decade. To the west, a grinding conflict with the Habsburgs along the Austrian frontier. To the east, a renewed struggle with Safavid Persia. These campaigns strained the empire's resources, demanding constant streams of men and money. The reports from the front alternated between triumphant conquests and costly stalemates, each bringing its own political ripples back to the capital. Victories bolstered the Sultan's prestige, but defeats, or even long sieges without resolution, stirred questions in the barracks and the council chambers alike. The Janissaries, long the Sultan's elite guard, had by this period become as much a political force as a military one. Their support could secure a ruler, their discontent could unseat him. In the 1592nd, their loyalty was less a matter of devotion than of timely payment. Delays in stipends, often caused by the treasury's wartime burdens, could spark open mutiny. Within the palace, their demands were met with a mixture of appeasement and wary calculation. The knowledge that an unpaid army is an unpredictable one. Mehmed III would inherit this reality on the very day he took the throne. The palace itself was a theatre of quiet rivalries. The harem, ruled in practice by Safiye Sultan, maintained an intricate web of alliances that stretched from the inner chambers to the foreign embassies across the city. Viziers vied for influence at the divan, each maneuvering to align themselves with whichever faction seemed most likely to hold power after the inevitable next succession. Letters and gifts flowed between Istanbul and Venice, London and Warsaw, their polite language concealing the urgency of trade concessions, alliance proposals, or intelligence gathering. For the city's ordinary inhabitants, life was a careful balance between opportunity and uncertainty. The population swelled with migrants from across the empire, Anatolian peasants seeking work, Balkan traders hoping to profit from imperial contracts, and craftsmen drawn by the city's demand for skilled labor. The streets were alive with hawkers calling their wares, water sellers weaving between carts, and the ever-present clatter of shipyards along the Golden Horn. Yet taxes rose to fund the wars, and conscription could pull young men away from their families for years. The grandeur of the capital did not shield its people from the empire's appetites. Religious life remained a powerful undercurrent in the city's politics. The ulema, the body of Islamic scholars, held influence not only over theological matters but also over the moral legitimacy of the Sultan's policies. In times of tension, their support could be summoned to justify wartime taxation or even extraordinary measures such as the enforcement of the law of fratricide. Preachers in the city's mosques spoke both to the faithful and, indirectly, to the palace, shaping public sentiment in ways that officials could not ignore. Beyond the marble courtyards, Istanbul was also a place of whispers. Coffee houses, though periodically condemned by moralists, flourished as centers of conversation and rumor. News from the front traveled here faster than official proclamations, carried by merchants, sailors, and soldiers on leave. Political gossip mingled with tales of miracles, omens, and celestial signs. A sudden comet, a storm on the Bosphorus, or an earthquake could be interpreted as divine commentary on the Sultan's reign, interpretations that might reach the ears of the superstitious as easily as the pragmatic. The wars abroad had another effect: the constant movement of goods, coin, and information through the city. This traffic made Istanbul not only the empire's heart but also a point of vulnerability. Smuggling, espionage, and foreign bribery all thrived in its crowded harbours. European envoys, officially here to negotiate treaties, quietly cultivated informants among palace servants, disgruntled soldiers, and merchants with debts to repay. The capital was never short of those willing to sell a secret for the right price. In this climate, the death of a sultan was never merely a private family matter. It was a public event with immediate political consequences, one that every faction prepared for in advance. The sudden absence of a ruler could shift the balance of war councils, alter the fortunes of entire mercantile families, or embolden the janissaries to press for fresh concessions. The city's stability in the 1592nd was therefore less a product of harmony than of the temporary alignment of competing interests. Foreign powers watched Istanbul closely during this decade, sending reports home that mixed admiration for its wealth with skepticism about its political cohesion. Venetian dispatches described a city magnificent in peace, yet always braced for war. English envoys, newer to Ottoman diplomacy, marveled at the efficiency of the bureaucracy even as they hinted at the danger of its factionalism. These observations were not idle. The intelligence gathered in Istanbul often shaped decisions made hundreds of miles away on distant battlefields. Amid this delicate equilibrium, Mehmed III's accession in 1595 would act as both a rupture and a continuation. The mechanics of the succession were well known, but the scale of his opening act, the deaths of 19 brothers, would be unprecedented in living memory. It would satisfy the law's demand for stability while unsettling those who had grown accustomed to the relative quiet of palace life under Murad III. For a city that had learned to live with its contradictions, the new sultan's first night in power would redefine the balance. Thus, the political landscape of 1592 Istanbul was one of layers. Opulence laid over tension, ritual concealing volatility, and order maintained not by peace but by the constant negotiation of power. Mehmed would not have to create instability, it was already there, woven into the city's daily life. All he had to do was act within the rules of a game where the stakes were nothing less than survival, and where, as the empire's capital knew too well, survival could be more perilous than defeat. Under the low winter sky of 1603, Topkapı Palace carried its usual contradictions. Courtyards bustled with ceremonial routine, but in the inner chambers the air seemed to thicken. The heavy scent of warmed oils and perfumed braziers clung to the corridors, as though trying to disguise the cold message of the day's summons. At the center of that message stood Shehzad Mahmud, Mehmed III's eldest son, a figure the empire might have expected to protect, not erase. Mahmud was young, popular, and dangerously well-liked by the Janissaries. That alone, in the brittle hierarchy of the Ottoman court, was enough to earn suspicion. Whispers reached the Sultan through the same web of informants that had once served his grandmother. By the time those whispers were repeated in the council chambers, they had grown into accusations of treachery, plots, and premature ambition. Whether the evidence was sound mattered less than the fact that the story had been told in the right ears. The decision was presented in the language of state necessity, not personal grievance. Chroniclers noted the formal tone of the decree. The prince was to be interrogated, punished, and, if found guilty, dispatched according to imperial law. This phrasing placed Mahmud in the same category as any other rival, an abstract problem to be solved. But inside the palace, the reality was more intimate, a father condemning his son while still seated under the same gilded dome. The interrogation was not the work of inquisitors but of household officials. Mehmed reportedly ordered Mahmud to be beaten for answers, a calculated show of dominance rather than an act likely to yield new facts. The echoes of those blows would have carried through the thick-walled chamber, dull but steady, like a craftsman's mallet against wood. Outside, the Sultan is said to have waited, not in ceremonial detachment but in physical proximity to the act. When the time came, the familiar machinery of execution moved into place. 4 deaf-mute attendants entered, their steps soft against the carpets. These were not strangers to the prince. They were part of the same palace staff that had served his daily needs. Their presence at this moment was not dramatic, not even confrontational. It was administrative, a duty being carried out as it had been many times before. The method had not changed from the night of the 19 stranglings. Silk cords were used, the absence of blood once again serving as the official marker of dignity. The act was designed to be quick, almost noiseless, as if history itself preferred to pass over the event without drawing attention. In that, the executioners were merely assisting the palace's long habit of selective memory. Mehmed remained outside the chamber, close enough to hear but not to see. Chroniclers differ on whether this indicated reluctance or resolve. One Venetian report suggested he waited to ensure completion, a sovereign monitoring the conclusion of a task rather than a father mourning a son. Either interpretation serves the same purpose. The execution was deliberate, controlled, and witnessed in all but sight. The aftermath unfolded with familiar precision. The prince's body was prepared according to royal custom, wrapped in fine cloth, and carried away under the watch of palace officials. There was no public display, no mourning procession. Instead, the event slipped quietly into the official record, recorded not as a tragedy but as a resolved matter of governance. Among the court, reactions were muted. Those who had favoured Mahmud understood the danger of speaking, while those who had feared his popularity saw the outcome as confirmation of their caution. In the Janissary barracks, the news was received with a restrained silence, an acknowledgement that even their favour had limits when set against the Sultan's will. Foreign observers recorded the episode with a mixture of incredulity and weary familiarity. To them, it was another example of Ottoman succession policy consuming its own future heirs. One French envoy noted, almost in passing, that the House of Osman spares no branch from its own pruning. The remark was intended as analysis, but it reads as reluctant admiration for the system's grim consistency. The execution of Shahzad Mahmud carried an irony too sharp for the palace to acknowledge. In eliminating the son most likely to inherit, Mehmed had safeguarded his present authority at the expense of his dynasty's continuity. Yet in the logic of the law, this was not a flaw but a feature, a demonstration that the throne's security outweighed even the bloodline's survival. As winter deepened, the palace returned to its rhythm. Audiences were held, petitions heard, banquets arranged. The silence surrounding Mahmud's death was not a gap in the record but an active choice, as though the empire itself had learned to look away from its own acts of preservation. Still, the image of a sultan standing just beyond a closed door lingered in the minds of those who knew, a reminder that in Topkapi, power was as much about proximity as it was about command. The next act in this sequence would come far sooner than anyone expected, and in a reversal that no amount of protocol could disguise. The Sultan, who had overseen the deaths of brothers and son alike, would not hold the throne much longer. The summer of 1603 began with heat pressing against the palace walls, thickening the air in the courtyards and turning the Bosphorus into a sheet of wavering light. Inside Topkapi, life followed its practiced choreography: processions to the divan chamber, petitions unrolled before viziers, the measured footfalls of courtiers across polished stone. Yet beneath the surface, the Sultan's health was shifting in ways no herald would announce. Mehmed III, 40 years old and only 8 years into his reign, began to withdraw from his duties. The vigour that had once propelled him through both ceremony and execution replaced by a deliberate stillness. Accounts from the period vary. Some chroniclers wrote of an illness that had taken root quietly, without the public spectacle of sudden collapse. Others hinted at the cumulative strain of his position, a reign bookended by mass executions and wars against Austria and Persia. The empire's physicians, schooled in Galenic theory, prescribed rest, controlled diet, and elaborate tonics. These measures did little to alter the outcome, but their application was as formal as any imperial decree. By late summer, Mehmed was rarely seen in public. Audiences were shortened or delegated entirely to his viziers. Foreign envoys reported delays in receiving audiences, noting that when granted, the Sultan appeared pale, his voice measured to the point of caution. In an empire where the monarch was both political head and sacred symbol, such visible restraint was not only a sign of weakness, but a potential signal to every faction weighing its next move. The timing of his decline lent itself to speculation. Mahmud's execution had taken place barely half a year earlier, and some saw the two events as linked. A father undone by grief. Others dismissed the idea entirely, citing Mehmed's proven ability to treat familial deaths as matters of state. In the archives, the correspondence of European diplomats alternates between these theories, neither fully convincing, both keen to impose narrative on uncertainty. The machinery of government continued regardless. The wars on the empire's frontiers required funding, troop movements, and negotiations, all of which proceeded with the Sultan increasingly as a name rather than an active participant. The viziers adapted smoothly, though one Venetian letter noted, with a trace of irony, that the empire seems designed to function perfectly well in the absence of its ruler. As autumn advanced, his condition worsened. Palace physicians shifted from remedies to palliatives. The fragrant smoke of burning herbs began to fill his private chambers, not only for medicinal purposes, but to mask the stale air of prolonged confinement. Servants moved more quietly than usual, their discretion not born of protocol alone, but of the awareness that an empire was listening for any sign of its master's final hours. On the 22nd of December, 1603, Mehmed III died within the palace, his passing announced only after the inner court had secured the transition to his successor, Ahmed I. There were no public vigils, no long eulogies. The death of a sultan was always as much a logistical challenge as a spiritual loss, and the Janissaries were paid promptly to ensure their calm. The absence of unrest was considered proof that the transition had been well managed. The surreal element lay in the chronology. In less than 7 years, Mehmed had reduced his immediate male relatives from a populous dynasty to a handful of heirs, only to die with the succession balanced on a single surviving son. It was as though the system of fratricide had reached its logical conclusion faster than even its architects intended. His funeral was conducted with customary precision. The body, washed and wrapped, was carried to its place beside his father, Murad III, and the 19 brothers he had ordered killed on his first night as sultan. No inscription recorded the personal nature of his reign. The stone spoke only of title, dates, and the lineage he had both preserved and thinned. Foreign reports of his death ranged from restrained obituaries to barely concealed astonishment at the brevity of his tenure. One English merchant in Galata wrote to London that the Ottoman court has shed blood enough to secure its crown, yet the crown itself seems eager to pass to other hands. The remark, intended for private correspondence, captured an uncomfortable truth. In this system, stability was often temporary, purchased at the cost of its own heirs. In the palace, life resumed its rhythm within days. The halls that had carried the scent of incense during his decline now echoed with the steps of the young Ahmed I. The same protocols that had attended Mehmed's rise, and the deaths that accompanied it, were quietly adjusted for a new reign. But the memory of his sudden absence lingered, a reminder that the Ottoman throne was never truly held, only occupied until history called it vacant. The story of Mehmed's death did not close his chapter so much as it opened the question of his legacy, a legacy measured less by territorial gain or reform than by the methodical pruning of his own dynasty and the strange endurance of the law that had made it possible. The news of Mehmed III's death moved quickly through the diplomatic networks of Europe, carried in letters that mixed court gossip with political analysis. In Vienna, the Habsburg court received the first reports not from their own ambassadors, but from merchants who had overheard the details in Galata coffeehouses. The Ottoman throne, one Austrian official wrote to a colleague, is again occupied by one who was last year a boy, for his father had no other heirs left alive. The observation was accurate, if understated. Mehmed's reign had begun with the most extensive fratricide in Ottoman history, and it ended with the succession hanging by a thread. In the Ottoman capital, the 19 deaths of 1,595 were never officially renounced. Court historians did not describe the event as cruelty, but as a moment of decisive governance. Chroniclers employed the same careful phrasing used since Mehmed II's time, that the elimination of rivals was necessary for the stability of the state. To them, the massacre was not a singular outrage, but an example of the law functioning exactly as designed. European diplomats, less inclined to euphemism, preserved the details in private dispatches. The Venetian Bailo wrote of 19 princes, each under the age of manhood, drawn from their chambers to their end in a single night. A French envoy noted the unsettling speed of the process, remarking that the executioners moved as though enacting a ceremony long rehearsed. These descriptions were not published, but they circulated in the chancelleries of Paris, London, and Madrid as case studies in the peculiar mechanics of Ottoman succession. Within the empire, official silence did not prevent the spread of quieter stories. Servants who had witnessed the preparations, janissaries who had heard rumours before the signal was given, and concubines who had lost companions to the silk cord, all contributed fragments to an oral history that was never written down, but never entirely forgotten. In these retellings, the massacre was less a matter of law than a night of shadows, closed doors, and hurried footsteps. The state's justification for the killings remained rooted in the same logic that had been laid down in the 15th century. Better the certain death of many than the possible civil war of a few. To its supporters, this was a grim but rational safeguard against the kind of dynastic chaos that had nearly destroyed the empire before Mehmed II's reforms. To its detractors, mostly foreign observers and later historians, it was a system that preserved the throne by steadily erasing the family that occupied it. Ironically, Mehmed's own actions demonstrated the inherent fragility of this arrangement. By removing so many male relatives in a single stroke, he left his dynasty exposed to the very instability the law was meant to prevent. The accession of Ahmed I, barely 14 years old, underscored the risk. The empire now depended on a child, with no reserve of adult princes to step in should he falter. Still, the precedent held. Later sultans would invoke the same right, though often with fewer victims at a time. The scale of Mehmed's opening night purge remained exceptional, yet it reinforced the idea that fratricide was not an aberration, but a legitimate tool of governance. The silk cord stayed in its place, coiled and ready, as much a part of the imperial regalia as the sword of state. Some foreign chroniclers attempted to capture the psychological atmosphere this created. One English traveller, writing decades later, claimed that every prince of the House of Osman wakes each day with both the hope and the dread that it may be his turn to reign. Whether or not the remark was based on first-hand knowledge, it distilled the paradox of Ottoman succession into a single sentence. In Istanbul's popular memory, the massacre faded into the background hum of imperial history, known, occasionally whispered about, but rarely challenged. The tombs beside Hagia Sophia stood in their silent cluster. Mehmed III, his father Murad III, and the 19 young men whose lives had ended before they had even begun to rule. Visitors might pause to read the inscriptions, but the stone gave no hint of the night's choreography. By the mid-17th century, the practice of fratricide began to wane, replaced by the less lethal, though still confining, kafes system that Mehmed himself had endured as a boy. Yet the memory of his 19 stranglings persisted in European writings as a shorthand for Ottoman severity. The image was too striking to discard, a ruler ascending the throne over the bodies of nearly an entire generation of his own kin. The legacy of that night, then, was twofold. Within the empire, it reaffirmed the law's authority and the state's priority over the individual. Beyond its borders, it became a symbol, sometimes of cruelty, sometimes of ruthless efficiency, always of the alien logic of a court where survival demanded the elimination of those closest to you. In both readings, Mehmed III's name remained inseparable from the silk cord, its quiet efficiency, and the echo of doors closing in the dark. The tomb of Mehmed III rests in the quiet courtyard beside Hagia Sophia, a place where the hum of the city fades into the low murmur of the wind. Within its walls, marble cenotaphs line the floor, each draped in green cloth, each marked by a turban carved in stone. His father, Murad III, lies here. So do the 19 brothers whose deaths opened his reign. In a gesture that feels almost deliberate, Mehmed's own burial place sits only steps away from theirs, as though the dynasty had decided to keep its story contained under one roof. Here, the dates and titles etched into stone offer no commentary. They do not tell of the night-long sequence of footsteps in Topkapi's corridors, or of the silk cords drawn tight behind closed doors. They make no mention of the janissary's measured silence, the divan's administrative detachment, or the suddenness with which a prince could become a threat. The marble records only the fact of a reign, leaving its method unspoken. For the Ottomans of the period, this was as it should be. The law that made fratricide possible was never a secret, but neither was it a subject for public debate. Its purpose was to preserve the throne, and it was judged not by morality, but by outcome. If the empire remained whole, the means were considered justified. The tombs, like the law, absorbed the consequences without complaint. In Europe, the story endured with a sharper edge. Travelers and diplomats repeated it as proof of the empire's Eastern severity, though their fascination often carried a grudging respect for the system's efficiency. The image of 19 silk cords pulled in near silence on a single night was too precise, too theatrical, to fade from foreign accounts. For centuries afterward, the anecdote would appear in histories, each retelling sharpening the contrast between the empire's grandeur and its internal brutality. The irony is difficult to overlook, a dynasty that survived for centuries in part by erasing itself from within. Mehmed III's reign exemplified this paradox more than any other. In securing his own claim, he thinned his family line to the point of fragility, leaving the empire to a boy heir and a system increasingly aware of its own unsustainable logic. Today, visitors who step into Mehmed's tomb may notice a single cord, suspended as a ceremonial relic in a glass case. It is delicate, almost decorative, its weave smooth, its weight deceptively slight. To the unknowing, it could be mistaken for an ornament. To the informed, it is an artifact of governance, as much a part of imperial history as the swords, banners, and seals displayed elsewhere in the palace. And so the story of Mehmed III closes not with the clash of armies or the rise of monuments, but with the soundless finality of silk. The cord waits quietly, as it once did in a drawer in the inner palace, ready for the next necessary use. In the end, it is not the man, the law, or the empire that remains, only the method, preserved in stillness, holding its place in the long memory of the Ottoman throne.